Trying to practice my own advice. I'm not running any fever, but I think every other neighbor I have is either blowing leaves or burning leaves, and so I've got about half of each of that in my sinuses, and so my body is trying to find some kind of balance there and get rid of what I don't need and process what I do, and so I'll try not to worry about that part of it, but I sound a little bit like Jerry Ray, but I don't feel like Jerry Ray said he felt, so keep that in mind. All right, this week and next week, what we'll try to do is to finish up the context of the three-cycle method, so when we get into our next study, and this next quarter we'll look specifically at how faith is developed. We have the framework for it. We see those in the past who demonstrated their faith or failed in their faith, and we'll look at that developmental process of how faith comes about. But last week we spent a little time looking at the book of Zephaniah and mentioned that he's in the last part of the history while they're still in the land. And we'll stop in just a moment and go back over our divisions, so we'll know those. But I just want to pick up where we left off, so maybe we can accomplish those tasks. But you remember Zephaniah was probably just before Josiah, who was 8 years old when he became ruler. And in that process, being as young as he was, he had to have people around him to kind of advise him and instruct him. In fact, he had to be protected. His life was being sought. They were trying to get rid of all the royal seed. And so he came to the throne in a very hostile environment. But when it was read to him and for him what the law taught, then I don't know what might have coming in or not. Then it's like for the first time he hears the law read and he weeps over that. He realizes they have not been faithful to that, and so he orders that all the idolaters' places be torn down, that they go out and be a unified effort to make sure that all the violations of this law were rectified. And he spent a lot of time doing that. He was a very good ruler and very active. So Zephaniah comes a little bit before all the idolaters' places were removed. And the way you know that, when you read through there, he's still referring to the idolaters' places. And so trying to fit him in the right time. And so this is just before the captivity takes place, and that is Judah in a complete way is taken away. They're taken away in waves, you remember. Those who are enlightened, those who are of the royal seed, those who have been taught in the ways of royalty would be taken and kept by Nebuchadnezzar. Let me find my little note here so we can plug in right after Zephaniah. If you're keeping up with it in your own Bible study, that captivity part will be right after Judah alone in 2 Kings chapter 18 and 2 Chronicles chapter 29 through 36. But then you have 2 Kings chapter 24 and 2 Kings chapter 36 that goes along with Daniel and Ezekiel. We spent most of our time last week rehearsing what was going on with Daniel and his comrade. But when you look at what's recorded in 2 Kings and Chronicles, you kind of get a little bit a broader sense of how this involved all the people. With Daniel, it's more of a narrowed focus of just what's happening in Babylon itself, specifically with these Hebrew youth. But it puts it in a historical sense when you look at 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles. You see these kings and what's going on in Judah, and looking at it from a little different perspective. Ezekiel, and Paul's mentioned this to us several times, Daniel's in the palace. He's dealing with royal people. He's dealing with Nebuchadnezzar and those who follow Nebuchadnezzar, he's in the know. In fact, he's in an elevated position. He's kind of put in charge of almost all the affairs of Babylon before it's all over. So you see that when you look at Daniel, you see some hiccups in that, in the sense that he's manipulated, he's lied about, he's thrown into the lion's den. All those things happen, but when you're looking at the context of it, Ezekiel's prophesying to the people who are not in the palace. They're in captivity, but they're down by the riverside. You know, they're some of the soulful songs in the Psalms come from the people in captivity looking back toward Jerusalem and weeping over their condition. They're longing to go home. And so the one prophesying to them is Ezekiel. So they're contemporaries. That is, Daniel and Ezekiel are. They're contemporaries during that time. But they are speaking to different populations of people. They're all Jewish people. Of course, Daniel speaks to the rulers too, but as far as our part of reading these books, this is a prophecy to God's people that enlighten us not only of what happened to them, but the prophecies concerning the coming kingdom. Nebuchadnezzar himself recognized that he represented that image, you remember, that he saw in his dream, that head of fine gold, and that there's going to be a kingdom coming after him. He could be aware of that breastplate of silver, and all the way down to the feet that was made up of different rules and kingdoms. And in that particular time, in that image, God was going to set up a kingdom which would never be destroyed. Well, he's already said in this image, these kingdoms are going to be destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar is not going to rule forever, and people who come after him are not going to rule forever. And you go down through that image, but he said when you get to the last part of that image, there is going to be a kingdom set up that will never be destroyed. Now, we know that that's the kingdom of the Lord. And you'll have Jesus quoting from these Old Testament prophets in reference to those kingdoms. And when Jesus met with his disciples for the last time before he ascended back to the Father, in Luke chapter 24, it said he opened their understanding that they might understand the Scriptures. And then he mentioned that prophecy. He didn't mention Daniel himself, but he placed all those prophecies together. And he talked to them about what was written in the prophets and in the Psalms and the law of Moses concerning him. That is, according to Jesus. This is the sum of it. He said, thus it is written, and thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead the third day. And that repentance and remission of sins should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. So all those prophecies then would point to the coming of Christ. But when they're happening, these people are just experiencing it. Daniel and his comrades are absolutely convinced. They know why they are in captivity. They have accepted the fact that they're in captivity. They don't plan to go anywhere else. They know it's going to be 70 years. They get busy doing exactly what the Lord told them to do, and they don't seem to be distracted by the other things that are happening around them. I made a couple of notes, and I'm not finding my little sticky note here. I don't want to belabor the point, but I certainly want to make sure that I don't leave out something that might be significant for you. That's not the one I wanted. Don't you hate to do that? It's good stuff too. If I don't find it, I'll get home and I'll find it stuck on my stand next to my chair and say, there it is. I don't want to get bogged down in those kings, but the handouts that Paul's given us has lined those up for us in such a way. I want you to go back and look at them when you get home so you'll know kind of how the timeline works. There it is. So while they're in captivity, Daniel and them among the first ones to go. And so they're already there. They're already going through the process of getting approved by the king to occupy offices in that foreign land. All that's going on with them in captivity. Since they were early ones, there's still some of their fellow Jews who are still in the land of promise. But it's not going so well for them. They're being oppressed, and most of these rulers, like Nebuchadnezzar, would go in and they'd take over a nation of people, and they would leave puppet kings in place. And in other words, they would say, if you're from a royal descent, we'll leave you in place just to manage things here, since these have been your people. Since you know how everything works here, but here's what you have to do. You're going to have to realize who's really in charge, and that's me. And you're going to have to make sure your people pay taxes to me. And if that continues, then I'll allow you to stay where you are. So there were a few of those last kings that you see in Judah who were really no more than that. They were placed there by Nebuchadnezzar, and you'll have those last ones that don't serve a whole long time. You'll have people like Jehoahaz that only rules 3 months. And in that process, particularly when you get down to Zedekiah and Gedaliah, those are the last rulers in Judah. They will be puppet kings, and that is they are of royal descent, but they really don't have any authority. When you look specifically at Zedekiah, he forgets that. All of a sudden, he decides he's going to rebel. Things go pretty smoothly, and that is he's able to function as a ruler. Taxes are being paid, but he decides he didn't want to pay those taxes anymore, and so he rebels against Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar then comes and besieges the city of Jerusalem. That's when it really, really gets bad. But Daniel and them are already in captivity. Sometimes when we're reading through it, we don't realize that they're not all together anymore. That there's still this historical thing taking place where God is punishing them for their rebellion, and they think, because they're still in the land, that they control things. And that's where Zedekiah was. And it becomes so bad with him that Nebuchadnezzar sends forces in, and they take Zedekiah and they gather all of his sons before him. And the last thing he's able to see with his physical eyes is his sons being killed. He gets to watch that. It's brutal. Can you think of a crueler thing to do? We kind of see on the news every now and then you have people who still do things like that. They want to hurt you by hurting people that you love. But because he'd rebelled against God, God sent the prophet to him and said, this is what's going to happen to you. And in the instructions, or at least the prophecy that he receives, he's told by the prophet acting out that he'll be bound and be led into captivity. That'll come true in the sense that he'll have to be led because he's blind. His eyes have been put out. But not until he gets to see his son slaughtered. Now, that's the last image he can play in his mind, because that's the last thing his eyes will be able to see. Brother Joe Touch and I talk about he's had cataract surgery. I'm going to have cataract surgery. You know, they've given me all these little measurements. You know, when this starts happening, then there's a little cataract there, but it's not bad, so don't worry about it. And when it gets to be this way, and well, guess what? All the prophecies have come true. You know, all the little signs are in place, and so since Brother Joe's had cataract surgery, I said, okay, what's that like? And he said, well, it's I'm getting better. And I said, you're not encouraging me here, brother. It's like have cataract surgery, the next day you're okay. Well, he had some complications with that. But in that process, he appreciates good vision. He appreciates a lack of pain, and he remembers what that was like. Now he's got to go through that process. But what his hope is, what my hope would be if I had cataract surgery is, I get my sight back. I can see clearly. But you see, he didn't get his sight back. And the only image he can really hold on to about having his sight is the slaughter of his sons. And it all comes back to the fact that he was disobedient to God. You say, well, it sounds like he got his eyes poked out because he's disobedient to Nebuchadnezzar. Well, that's part of it, because God said, don't fight it. You had time to fight it. You had time to make sure that you were obedient to me. You had time to make sure that you weren't worshiping idols. You had time to be obedient to me. That time is up. So you just go and submit yourself to the king. And Zedekiah was told specifically, submit to Nebuchadnezzar. That sounds kind of odd when you think, well, these are heathen people. But God said, I'm sending by power from the north, and he's going to punish you for your idolatry. You took idolatrous things into my temple. And you polluted my temple. And so your time's up. There's a process to this. You might as well submit to the process. With Zedekiah, things got a little better, and so he rebelled. And with that, Nebuchadnezzar took him into captivity, but slaughtered his sons before him. And then you have Gedaliah, and he really doesn't do anything other than what he's told to do. So they're technically still in the land. They are technically, still a nation of people, but really not the people of God anymore, because God's punishing them. And but I wanted to spend a little time with that, because sometimes we just lump it all in there together. Is if they're all in Babylonian captivity, and they're not. They're all under Babylonian rule, but not all of them are in Babylon. And so some of them are still in the land, and that's what's going on with them in that process. Then you flip the script a little bit. A lot of time passes, 70 years, while they're in captivity. Babylon rules in that 70 years. The Medo-Persians rule during that 70 years. And so you have a multiplicity of people who are controlling. And when the Medo-Persians took over Babylon, they also took over all the nations that Babylon had conquered. So this was their kingdom now. So all those things are happening from Daniel's perspective. And he's accepting them. He does the same thing under each of those rulers, and he knows it's going to be 70 years. No matter who's at the top, God still rules in the kingdoms of men, and he said, we're going to be here 70 years, so we're here 70 years. Outside that, you had different attitudes and dispositions from those who were still in the land. Some of them continued in idolatry. Some of them intermarried with the people who were left in that land. And that affects what we understand when we get to that section where a return from captivity. There's a process to that too. They don't just all return. There's a process to that. There are different letting goes, and that is when Babylon was taken out of the way and the Medo-Persians taken back, you had been prophesied by the prophet Isaiah that there would come a servant of God. His name would be Cyrus. He was even named before he ever came to power. He was named, and he would be God's shepherd. He would see that God's people could return from captivity. And it came about. He had the Chronicles read for him. And while he was listening to the reading of these Chronicles, he heard his name. And he heard that he would be the one who let God's people go. And so he started that process, and they didn't all go back. Some of them never went back. Some of them didn't want to go back. God had told them before they went into captivity, you go there, you build your houses, you plant your gardens, because you're going to be there 70 years. Well, sometimes when you get to a place and you've been there that long, that becomes home to you, doesn't it? You've had your children there. You've made your life there, and maybe you're too old. No record at all of Daniel ever going back. He died in the Babylonian land. And so those things are important, because when we get to Ezra and Esther, where the return starts, then again you have some who are still in the land, and you have some who are coming back to the promised land. And Ezra is one of those who comes back. He leads one of those first groups. With Zerubbabel, they come back to the land. And so when you read through Ezra and Esther, that's the time period. These 70 years are completed. Cyrus has, and other leaders after him, have allowed the Israelites to go home. Some of those, like when we get to Nehemiah, he's in the king's palace, and so he's the king's cupbearer. He's not allowed to go back and stay, but he is allowed to go back and complete the task of rebuilding the wall, and then he would come back to the king. So those things go on when you read Ezra and Esther. That's in that section of the return from captivity. And I mentioned those together because Ezra is one of those who came back, and he's the one who prepared his heart to serve the Lord and to teach statutes and judgments in Israel. So he was a scribe, a teacher, who instructed the people what they're supposed to do when they went back. Rebuilding the temple, restoring proper worship. That was going on in the Promised Land with Ezra. When you read that book, that's what you read about. During that same time frame, Esther, the book of Esther. And Esther's still in the Babylonian area. Ahasuerus is that king who is ruling. You remember the story about Vashti, the queen who wouldn't expose herself to his princes who came for the festival. He wanted her to dress immodestly, and she refused to do it. And so he deposed her. A lot of good stories there. I don't want to get lost in them. But the men, it sounds like the king himself didn't really know what to do. The queen had refused to show herself to all the princes who'd gathered. But he didn't initiate the punishment of Vashti. His princes said, you know what's going to happen? Now, this is Jerry Martin's paraphrased version of what happened here. They said, you know what's going to happen if you let your woman refuse to do what you told her to do? Do you know what all the women of the kingdom is going to do? And so that was their perspective. Like, you better do something about your woman. You better do something about the queen. You have publicly asked her to do something, and she has publicly refused. And this is what's going to happen in the public. None of us are going to be able to control our women. Now, it wasn't used in those words, but that's what they say. And so you're going to have to do something about this. And so he dethrones her. He removes her from being the queen. And he puts out this decree about the matter. And he begins the process of replacing her. Esther is the one who replaces Vashti. She's a pure virgin, and he has all the pure virgins brought before him, and she finds favor in his eyes, and she becomes queen. That's happening there. That's happening after the Medo-Persians take over. That's still happening in the Babylonian area. And they're still fighting against other people. That's when they go into Grecia, and that's where they stir up what will eventually be Alexander the Great. That's when the Medo-Persians go over there and start tampering with things in Grecia. And it doesn't go well for them. And it builds up some resentment. And so that produces Alexander the Great in our history books. He's down here on that bottom part of that image that Nebuchadnezzar saw. So it's not disconnected. But that's taking place there while Ezra and the others are rebuilding the temple and reinstituting the law back in the Promised Land. And when you read through that book of Esther, God's name is not mentioned. Kind of an interesting look at things. We know that she's a Jew. We know that she's one of the captives. We know that her uncle, Mordecai, we know that he advises her. And he tells her that she needs to go and there's been a decree passed by evil Haman, you remember, that all the Jews are going to be killed. And he's so mad at Mordecai because he won't bow down to him. And so he gets the king to agree to an edict that they can destroy the Jews. He doesn't know that Esther's a Jew. So Mordecai sends word to Esther and said, look, who knows but what you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Somebody needs to tell the king what's taking place. Somebody needs to intercede for the slaughter of the Jews. He said, you may choose not to do it. If you don't, there will be help raised up from somewhere else. But he lets her know that she has an opportunity to do right. I wanted to mention those together because they're happening in two different places. She's one of those that hasn't come back to the promised land, while Ezra is taking care of those things. When you read through Ezra and Nehemiah, you see that they're the building of the temple and the rebuilding of the wall gets interrupted. The dregs of the people who are still in the land, when I say dregs, they are descendants of the Jews who never went into captivity. They stayed in the promised land, they intermarried with the people there, and they weren't really fully attached to anybody. But when the Jews came back by the edict of God, and they began that process of rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the walls, and they got jealous. They wanted to participate in that, and Nehemiah and Esther said, you don't really have any part in this. This is not something that God's going to allow you to do. And so they sent a letter back to the king in the Babylonian area and said, these folk that you've let go, they're building a wall so they can rebel against you. Well, they had permission to do what they were doing. They had letters. But you know what that process is like, don't you? The letter gets there, and they didn't just put that on the Facebook. Everybody heard it. You know, they had to send a letter, got all the way to the king, and got all the way to the presentation before the king, and got to wait for the king's response to go all the way back down and say you can or you can't. And so it was halted. You need to know that life is still going on in the Babylonian area. You still have a kingdom there. You still have Jews that are under the rule of those folks there. You have slaughter of the Jews taking place there. And when it says the king gives Haman an edict to kill all the Jews in the kingdom, because he said the Jews are causing you problems. They're trying to rebel against you. Now you get a letter. Now that king gets a letter from the people in the promised land saying they're rebelling here too. You can see that there's a real complication. We read the books, we kind of disconnect them sometimes, and we don't have a good time frame. And that's why Paul's been laying this groundwork to say, know what order these things came in. So when you slip those books in those chronological orders, you'll see all this is going on at the same time. So that you can get a comprehension of what that's like. So you have Ezra and Nehemiah, or rather Ezra and Esther taking place at the same time. And then you have, Haggai and Zechariah, who again are prophets to those who are coming back to captivity. And both of those will rebuke them for they get a little spiritually out of focus. They start that process of rebuilding the temple, and sometimes we may think they just stopped, but they had to stop for a while because of the king's edict said, I got to look into this matter, see what's going on there. So they had to stop. Well, what's going to happen while they're stopped building the temple and stopped building the wall? Well, they're going to get focused on themselves. And they start building their own houses. And so when you look at Haggai and Zechariah, you have them being rebuked for that. You're living in glass houses, it says. You're living in these mansions, and the Lord's house is not finished. It's in disarray. Your spiritual focus is out of place. And that's what you need to see when you look at those books. They are, they fit into that time when they've been brought back into the land. The same would be true with Nehemiah and Malachi. Now, Malachi will be the last book of the Old Testament. What comes after that? 400 years of silence. Now, these prophets are a lot of voices speaking forth for God at different times in their history, and then nothing. That has to be a little disconcerting, doesn't it? You know, you have opportunity to hear and opportunity to hear, and all of a sudden, nothing. Kind of like telling mom and daddy you want them bothering you in your life, and you call them to get advice, and they don't answer the phone. Like, hey, I've tried to call you for 2 weeks. You didn't answer. Like, I had things to do. Last time we talked, you said you didn't need my help, and so I'm assuming you don't need my help. God kind of treated them that way. You know, they get in these situations, they'd call out to him, and he would send these prophets to advise and help them, and finally they just quit listening. And so after that, he quit speaking to them for about 400 years. Keep those things in mind. Now, we've probably got 5 minutes to go, and so let's do our review. Before the flood, scattering of the people, patriarchs. Who after patriarch? Exodus. So we have the book of Exodus and them leaving Egypt. What happened after that? All right, the wandering in the wilderness took place after that. Then what? Say that again? All right, invasion and conquering of the land. That's when they finally crossed over the Jordan. We'll talk about that in the sermon a little bit this morning. Then after the conquering of the land, Judges. After the Judges, United Kingdom. They had asked for a king, they got a king. They had 3 kings who ruled over them as a collective people. Then after that, what? Divided kingdom. Had Jeroboam, who rebelled with the 10 tribes. You had Rehoboam, Solomon's son, who ruled the southern kingdom, Judah and Benjamin. Then after the United Kingdom and divided kingdom, you had what? Judah alone. So the northern 10 tribes taken into Assyrian captivity, you had Judah by themselves. After Judah by themselves, captivity. They were taken into Babylonian captivity. And then what? They returned from captivity. That's what we talked about this morning with those specific books. A lot of things going on still in the land of promise when the captivity process had started. Then the return from captivity the same way. Things are going on in the context, and then what happened? Okay, return from captivity, then 400 years of silence. Then what? Life of Christ. All the fulfillment of those things prophesied about the kingdom that would never be destroyed had to have the king. Christ came. This day is born unto thee in the city of David a Savior, which is Christ the Lord. Life of Christ, and then what? Okay, early church, and then those epistles that instructed the church as to how to behave. So those are the different periods of time where these books fit in that will help you in your Bible study to kind of keep focus on that. All right, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Now you know the framework. Now you know where each of those books kind of fit in those periods of time. Now when you read them, you kind of know what's going on with the people and how God's plan is being carried out. And we'll try to finish that up next week and kind of put a bow on it, and we'll start our new quarters study after that.